Jeet Kune Do is known as the way of the intercepting fist, and most Jeet Kune Do practitioners, want to be able to intercept their opponent. But what happens when you can't do that? What happens when maybe your opponent's too fast, or he's bombarding you with punches, or your timing is off? Every time you try to intercept him, you can't read him, and then maybe he hits you. Have you ever been in that situation? Well, I'm going to tell you kind of what to do when you find yourself in that predicament. And stick around to the end of the video. We're going to teach you exactly how to read your opponent and what signs and tells to look for in your goal to be able to intercept your opponent. Now, I tell my online students, and if you're enrolled in the online program, you'll know this, but if you're not enrolled, please check us out at www.jkdprocess.com, and we'll teach you JKD from A to Z. And so what you want to do in the process of intercepting, and we tell our students in the beginning, is they want to be able to measure themselves off, right? You want to maintain distance between you and your opponent. And so we call this essentially your fighting measure. How, what the space between myself and my opponent. Now, the important aspect to this is that I need to be able to maintain enough distance between myself and my opponent so I can see what he's doing. If I have time, because of the distance, I have time to see what he's doing. I have time to, again, perceive what he's doing. We talk about 5 types of speed. Perceive what he's doing, decide on what I want to do to react to that, my mental speed. I have time to initiate a response and deliver whatever attack or defense that I'm going for. However, there are times in which your opponent is either too fast, or there's situations in which, that's not possible. If you can maintain fighting measure, it's a little bit easier to intercept your opponent. But what we want to talk about is when you can't maintain fighting measure. Maybe you're in close quarters. Maybe you don't have the space, the distance. Maybe your opponent just keeps moving forward and there's nothing that you've been able to do to get them to go backwards. And so let's talk about some options that you may have. And this happens a lot if you're the smaller fighter. I'm typically the smaller fighter when I'm sparring and training. I'm only $150, and so most people that I train with are bigger than I am, and so they use that to their advantage, right? And so they're rushing forward and they're throwing haymakers and all sorts of bombs, and I don't like getting hit, so I have to figure out a way around it. And so there's a couple things you can do. The one you can do, and sometimes you have to be able to do this, and you need to train yourself to be able to do this. One option when you are being bombarded with punches is to meet fire with fire. This is an option. It may not be the best option depending on the situation, but if you're being overwhelmed with punches and you're in this kind of close range and it's impossible to really see the punch and be able to intercept, you're too close. There's no way you can see the punch, but by the time you see the punch, you're already getting hit. If you're in that situation, you do have the option to hit back in the same manner. Will you get hit? Most likely, absolutely. You'll likely get hit in the process of trying to hit your opponent. However, you're probably going to get hit anyway, okay? So if you know you're going to get hit anyway because you're this close, throw some punches as well. So at least you're able to return fire. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that'll back the person off of you because now you're fighting back in the fray. So that's number one. You have to be able to brawl. Now, this is what they tell boxers. You can box your opponent, but then you can also brawl. And so those are 2 different types of fighters. Brawlers tend to just come in and they're just banging. They're just throwing. They're not really trying to set things up very pretty and try to score points. They're trying to knock you out. And so you have to have a little bit of that in you. If all you want to do is intercept, which is good, and Jeet Kune Do practitioners are very good at intercepting. However, when people get close to us, we typically, there are some JKD guys that just get beat up. Once you get within that range and they don't have time to intercept you, they're getting beat up. And so you need to be able to understand that don't just train to intercept because you can't always intercept. And so you have to be able to also brawl if you need to. Have that fight in you because you may have to call on that in some situations. Don't limit yourself to just fighting at fighting measure because you're not always going to be there. Okay, so that's number one. Next one we're going to talk about is grappling, of course, right? So if he's bombarding me and I can't intercept and I'm fighting in the pocket, maybe I can tie him up. Maybe I can tie him up somehow. Maybe I can get him into a clinch. Maybe I can shoot for his legs. Maybe I can take him down. Maybe I can throw him. There's all sorts of things that you can potentially do in a grappling situation. Again, I tend to be the smaller fighter, and so I usually don't want to grapple with somebody who's bigger than I am. Even if they're a bad grappler, a lot of times I'm going to go to my back, and in a self-defense situation, that's a bad spot. It doesn't matter how good your jiu-jitsu is. It's just a bad spot when you're on your back, especially in the street. And so you can engage in the grappling. Just be mindful of those risks. But those risks also exist if you're also brawling. You just kind of have to, weigh the options on where you think you might get the most success in. Now, obviously, when you're going back to brawling, when you're brawling, you're not just throwing punches. If you're boxing or sparring, probably. But in self-defense, you're throwing headbutts, you're throwing strikes to the groin, you're throwing knees, you're throwing finger jabs, claws to the eye, strikes to the throat, all sorts of things you're doing, pulling the ear, doing whatever it takes to get out of that situation. And so that's the advantage sometimes of those tactics when you're in close. Now you're in CQC, now you're in close quarters combat, and so it does become that dirty boxing. And so it's hard to train that in sparring, but it's something to think about. I'd probably rather be there utilizing the dirty boxing, because now it's a little bit more even than trying to grapple or wrestle with someone. But again, in sparring, if you're sparring or competing, maybe you have the opportunity to tie him up. And you see Floyd Mayweather does this a lot. When he gets in trouble, he's gonna grab, okay? And people hate him for that. And honestly, I'm not mad at him, because if they let him do it, they let him do it. It is what it is. And so he's learned to work the game that way. And so that's just something you got to be able to do. If you're going to bombard it and you need to grab the guy, okay? All right, next one is circling. Circling. Sometimes when they're coming forward on you, yes, you can meet them head on. You can kind of brawl. Maybe you can grapple. If you have the distance and spacing, you can also circle. Try to move off at the angle. Try to circle around them and get them to chase you a little bit. Because as they chase you, hopefully they get a little bit tired and they'll maybe slow down and stop and give you a break to reset and get back to fighting measure. Not always, but circling is good because it forces them now to chase you. And if they do attack you, they may be off angle when they attack. You can't run forever, however, so just be prepared in the process of circling to immediately maybe shoot forward on an attack if you see an opening or an opportunity. And we'll cover those in a little bit. The last one is really just you also rushing forward. And so we have in our curriculum is something we call it, in Jeet Kune Do, we call it the jam, where you're rushing in, you're smothering your opponent. And so that's something that you can do, because what that does is now you're taking the initiative. If you know you're dealing with somebody who's very aggressive and they're going to come at you, they're going to bombard you with punches, instead of waiting for that to happen, sometimes you may want to take the initiative and to rush in and maybe push them back instead. Certainly you can throw your punches, you can go into brawling from here, but the idea is really for you to push in and not wait. And what that's going to do is that's going to change the pace of the fight. Because now if you're pushing in, if you're the aggressor now, what do you think that does to your opponent? That makes them now the defender. So now they become more passive. They become more on defense. And they're sometimes not thinking in offense because they're just worried about not getting rushed, or not worried about not getting taken down. They're worried about, you rushing in on them again. And so even if you don't do anything when you rush in, even if you just smother them and tie them up, they don't want that to happen because they want to punch you in the face. And so they don't want to necessarily get close to you because they're afraid you may tie them up or grab them. And so sometimes they're going to work to maintain their own distance, which is going to then allow you to be able to intercept them, hopefully a little bit more easily. Now, those are 4 tips when dealing with a very aggressive opponent. Last thing is in reading your opponent. So how do you read your opponent? How do you gauge when it's an appropriate time to hit them? It's very difficult to do, I'll be honest. And so, especially if an opponent that you don't know, you've never sparred with or fought before, it's very difficult to know how or when to intercept. I will tell you there's an old adage that says, hit when your opponent moves and move when your opponent is hitting. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So there's a couple times in which I prefer to attack primarily. One is when my opponent's moving, when they're stepping, when their feet aren't planted. So if they're stepping to their right, that's when I want to hit. I don't want to wait till they get here and then try to attack. I want to attack as they're stepping because it's going to be very difficult because their feet are set. It's going to be very hard. It's harder for them to throw or launch an offense. And if they do launch an offense, it's not going to be as strong as if their feet were planted and set and they're ready to drop bombs. So that's number one. I want to be able to hit while my opponent's moving. Number 2, sometimes you can tell when your opponent's thinking about something. You can tell when they're in deep thought, or maybe they're looking at a particular target, or something's going on mentally within them. And sometimes you can gauge this by throwing a feint and seeing what their reaction is. If you throw a feint and their reaction is to punch, then you know your opponent is going to be very aggressive, or very offensive. And typically, I'm going to be more hesitant to initiate if somebody throws a punch when I throw a feint. Now, but you can counter that. You can counter their punch, especially if you know what they're going to throw or you know kind of where they're at. But if they are more defensive, when I throw a feint and they kind of clench up or defend up, now I kind of know what their general reaction is going to be. But they also know that you know that, so they may change out what they do. However, if you throw your initial feint and they're more defensive, go ahead and throw your next attack, whatever that may be. Typically, you're going to attack on a different line. So that's another way you can set up your offense. It's not technically a interception. Yeah, it's not technically an interception, but it is, as long as it lands, as long as it hits. And then the last one, really, again, is just being able to hit while your opponent is retracting or moving their attacks back. So at that point, their energy is going back. So if I just threw a rear straight and my punch is on the way back, typically, as my punch is retracting, you don't have to worry about this coming back out. Some people throw a double punch, maybe, but it's very unlikely. And so a lot of times you can follow this energy back in and attack. And so that's often at times another opportunity to attack your opponent. And we cover in our online training the 5 timings of an attack in terms of the stages or phases of an attack. And so that's one of them there. So that's our video. If you want to get started learning Jeet Kune Do, check out our next video. We're talking more about some things to do in the beginning when you're just starting your Jeet Kune Do journey. Again, there is more information on all of this at www.jkdprocess.com. I want to get to know what you guys are doing, what you guys are training. Please connect with me there at jkdprocess.com, and we'll see you in the next video.